Welcome to a brand new First Thursday mystery. A lot of our blocks this year are going to be 5 inches finished, and there are a lot of them. So this month I actually have 5 for you, and if that's overwhelming, I know I put in the class description that we would have as many as 4. So if you just absolutely cannot get 5 done in a month, then I will accept 4 finished blocks for your homework. But all the blocks this month are based on squares or rectangles, so I thought this was the easiest time to put some extras in there. So these are the fabrics for the first block. It is a Scrappy 16 patch, so there are 16 squares there. This is the first year that the designer Under the Garden Moon hasn't said on each block to spray your fabric first with starch, sizing, or best press and press dry. I do recommend that you do that. I'm a believer after the last 3 years. We are not pre-washing this fabric. So one of the things that spraying it and pressing it dry does is help take some of the shrinkage out. It will also stabilize the fabric. So when we start cutting triangles and have bias, it will help it be less likely to stretch. And it also makes the fabric a little bit stiffer and easier to work with. So I don't have spray starch. I choose not to use starch mainly because I've lived on the East Coast and the West Coast, and bugs like to eat fibers. Although it's not really the fibers they're after, it's the impurities. So if there's starch in the fabric, then that's what they're after. So if you choose to use starch, you're going to want to be sure to wash your quilt when you're finished. So magic sizing is available in the grocery stores or anywhere else that they sell laundry products, so you can use that. Or Best Press is a spray starch alternative. It comes in several different scents. This one happens to be scent free. So what you're going to do before you start, and I've already done it on mine, it doesn't have to be the wrong side, but it could be either side. We're going to lay out our fabric on our pressing surface, whichever product you choose to use. You're going to spray it, just damp, lightly spray it, and then you're going to press dry. Pressing is an up and down motion, not a back and forth. We don't want to stretch the fabric out a square. So it's up, pick up your iron, move again, down again, and that's what we're going to do all the time in quilting, is press, not iron. After I have pressed all my pieces of fabric dry, I'm going to trim all 16 pieces down to 1 3/4 inches square. And I find that when I'm working with smaller pieces, it's easier to work with smaller rulers. So this one happens to be a 5-inch, this one happens to be just 12 inches long. If I have the 24-inch one hanging out there, it's kind of in my way when I'm cutting such small pieces. And I am working for the camera, so I'm using some smaller mats than I usually would as well, but whatever works for you. So when I'm cutting, it's a good idea to have a nice sharp rotary cutter blade, and I haven't changed this one super recently. I'm cutting 4 at a time. You do not have to. If you're uncomfortable doing that, then you can cut 1 at a time, because if you're cutting 4 at a time, one mistake multiplies times 4. So I have them all stacked up. The first thing I'm going to do after I line up my ruler on here is clean cut 2 edges. So there and there, and you really shouldn't cut toward yourself. Now, I could pick up those pieces and turn them around to cut the other sides, or I could walk around to the other side. I got out a smaller mat, so I can take it and just twist it around. It's better not to pick up your pieces because you can get them out of straight, and especially when I have a stack of 4 of them, I can get them uneven again. So I will admit that you will probably see me this year actually pick them up and move them, but it's better not to. They'll stay more accurate. So I cut those 2 edges already. So now I'm lining up my 1 3/4 inch mark on the 2 edges I just cut. And do double check. I don't have a lot of extras. In fact, some of these I don't have any extras. You'd have to buy more fabric. But it is a Scrappy quilt. So as long as it kind of reads as in the same group, you could replace it with anything. So there's my first 4 squares. And I'm just going to repeat the same thing. So I'll do it once more for the camera. going to put my ruler on here, clean cut 2 edges. And then I'm going to turn my mat or walk around if you have it in a spot where you can do that. And then line up my 1 3/4 mark here and do my final 2 cuts. So I will do the rest of them off camera. Our next step is to arrange our squares into a 16 patch or a 4x4 grid in an arrangement that you like. There is no right or wrong. Once you have an arrangement you like, we're going to sew these together in 4 patches. So for a 4 patch, we're going to sew a row, and I'm going to do that. Then press, and then we'll sew those 2 rows together. So we're going to make 4 patches. Now accuracy is going to be important on these blocks because we do have a lot of blocks finishing at 5 inches. Unfinished will be 5.5. I'm going to be lazy and splice in from last year's video my talk on getting an accurate 1/4 inch seam. All right, I've sewn all my squares together in pairs, and now it's time to press. I'm going to press the top row, all of the seams going one direction, and I just chose that they would all go to the right. Second row, they're all going to the left. Third row, all to the right. Fourth row, all to the left. I want my seams to go in opposite directions as much as possible because then when I go to put it together, those seams will nest and it will help with my accuracy. So when I'm pressing, I'm going to take the piece that I stitched, I'm going to press the seam as sewn. So I'm just pressing it flat to set my threads. Then, whichever way I'm going to press toward that was the fabric that was on the top. I'm going to flip up that piece and put it over, and then I'm just going to press down. And I do sometimes use the edge of my iron just to nudge that seam, but again, it's not a back and forth motion, it's an up and down motion. Whoops, I didn't mean to press those. So this one is going the other way. So I'm going to press it as sewn, so it's just flat. And then, I'm going to press that seam. So I'm going to do that to all of them. If you're not feeling confident about your 1/4 inch seam and how accurate it is, then you might want to check the first couple that you sew. These units should be 3 inches wide now. So mine are, or close enough, so my 1.5 inch mark would be on my seam, and then my raw edges should be lining up with the outside and the 3 inch mark. So now, when you know they're 3 inches wide, because if they're wider than that or narrower than that, then your block's not going to finish to the right size, we're going to sew them together in 4 patches. So I've kind of separated them into a 4 patch. Because our seams are going opposite directions, when we go to put them together, they sort of almost lock right there. So we're going to just sew our 1/4 inch seam. I've sewn all my 4 patches together, and I'm keeping them all oriented the same way. And there is a reason for that. So now the pattern tells us that you're going to pop the center seam. I didn't say before, but when you are piecing for quilting, you generally do not want to back stitch to start and stop your seams. You're going to be crossing your seams, so that will hold them, and back stitching adds bulk. So we're going to pick up our piece, and popping the seams only works one way. We're going to be twisting over the last seam that we stitched. If I twist it this way, let's see if you can see. If I twist it this way, nothing happens. But if I twist it this way, see how the couple stitches pop right there in the center, and I can separate. And then I can press my seams in a pinwheel so that they're all going the same way. In this case, it's counterclockwise. Now, the pattern tells you to make sure they all go the same way. If you put your blocks all together the same way, exactly the same way, they will. But you can't decide when it comes to popping which way they're going to go. It only works one direction. So again, if I pick this one up and go this way, nothing happens. The fabric just folds back on itself. This is the last seam I sewed on this block. If I twist this way, then a couple stitches pop out in the center, and I'm going to be able to open it up and have it pinwheel. She also says you can unpick, so if you had too short of a stitch length, you might have to pull a couple of stitches out to be able to do this. So I'll just do all of them. This way nothing happens. This way it pops. There we go. And I know which way it's going to pop this time. Sometimes you have to test it to see which way it's going, because if you're not making all your blocks the same way, it won't necessarily pop. So I've popped that seam. And now it's time to press my block. Those out of the way. That way, that one's already pressed. That was from my first one. This way it goes here. This one's already pressed, but if you want to press again, you can. And then the last one goes this way. I'm still pressing from the front because it's easier to make sure that I don't get tucks and stuff. So see, I get a little tiny 4 patch in the back. So this will work on any block where all your seams meet in the center. So if you were doing a kaleidoscope block with 8 pieces, you can split it and get the spin going there as well. So you're going to press all 4. As long as you've kept all your pieces in the same places where they were originally and pieced the same way I did, your seams are going to still be going opposite directions. So now we're just taking these 4 pieces and making a 4 patch again. So I will sew it together in rows like this. I've sewn my 2 rows together, and once again I can pop that seam. It's 4 pieces coming into the center, so it doesn't work that way, it works this way, so that my seams are going opposite directions. Same thing on this one. I can pop it, only one direction works. And once you get used to it, you'll probably be able to tell pretty easy. So now I'm ready to press. And again, I'm pressing here. This seam's going one way, and this seam's going the other. Same thing on this one. This one's going this way, and the other one is going this way. So now I take it back to the sewing machine and sew it, my final seam in the center, and all my seams are going opposite directions. I put the last seam in, and now I can split my center or pop my center seam again. There we go. And press. This side goes that way. And the reason for popping the seam is you don't end up with as much bulk at your intersections. Because if you were putting like 8 pieces together and they're all coming into one place and you're pressing to one side, then you're going to have a very bulky intersection. So that finishes our Scrappy 16 patch. It should be 5.5 inches square at this point. Our next block is a 4 patch variation. And you only have 3 fabrics for this one: a blue square, beige square is what they're calling it, and a red rectangle. So from our red rectangle, we are going to cut 2 3-inch squares. So to do that, I'm going to line my ruler up and clean cut 2 edges just like I did before. And then so I'm going to make this rectangle 6 inches long and 3 inches wide. So I'm lining my 6-inch mark up with the narrower edge, and I'm lining my 3-inch mark up with the long edge. And I'm going to cut those 2 sides. And then I'm just going to move my ruler back to the 3-inch mark. And again, I'm lining up, it doesn't matter which line now, with the long edge, any line with the long edge. And I usually choose not to use a whole number one because there are fewer marks to distort or to distract or get in my way to see. So I'm lining up a line on this side, my 3-inch mark on this side, and cutting, and that gives me my 2 3-inch squares. From my beige square and my blue square, I need 1 3.5-inch square from each. So I have mine stacked up together. Again, you don't have to do that if you don't want to. So a 3.5-inch square. So as always, we're going to clean cut 2 edges. And some of you might be saying, why aren't they cut to size? Well, when you spray starch them and stuff, the size can change. Also, I'm not interested in being responsible for your accuracy in any way, so I just make sure that your pieces are big enough, have a little extra in your kit. So I've clean cut these 2 sides. I'm going to line up my 3.5-inch mark here, my 3.5-inch mark here, and I'm going to cut and cut. And we're going to make our 4-patch a little different with this block. We're going to take, I could have put them right sides together and I wouldn't have had to fool with this after cutting. I'm going to put my beige square and my blue square right sides together. Then I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and sew 1/4 inch from 2 opposite sides. Okay, so I have sewn on 2 sides, and now we're going to cut this with 2 cuts. We're going to cut 1 3/4 inches from the sides, both directions. So to help keep it straight, I do have a line on even the edge I'm not cutting, so I have 1 3/4 here. And I do not want to disturb this. If you do, then just work on one at a time. I just rotated my mat 1/4 turn. And again, I'm lining up a line on the short edge. I have my 1 3/4 mark here, and I'm going to cut. So those 2 cuts just gave me 4 4-patch units. I'm going to take these and I'm going to press toward the blue. Now that I have pressed, I'm going to put them together in pairs and make a 4-patch. Because I pressed toward the blue, the seams are going in opposite directions. Okay, I sewed my 4 patches together and I did pop my center seam and pressed in a pinwheel. Now, I'm arranging mine so my blue runs diagonally through the block. We're going to pair it to make another 4-patch with our 3-inch red squares. If you turn it this way, you'll have a red chain running through the block. So you could go either way. I want the blue because it's more dominant. So I'm going to sew them together in pairs, and I will press toward the red because there's less bulk there. Probably the pattern says to as well. I don't know, I haven't looked. And then I will sew them together to finish off a 4-patch. Here's my finished 4-patch variation. I sewed it together in rows, pressed toward the red, and then I sewed those 2 rows together. Again, I popped my center seam so that the seams will pinwheel around. These are the fabrics for the double framed 4-patch. You have a red floral, a brown. The pattern says you have 1 beige strip. You actually have 2 because I miscut, but it will still work. I will show you, and I also put a sticker on those pieces in your kit. And then it says you have a golden brown strip. Ours is a little more gold than brown. First thing we're going to do is cut our red and brown pieces, and because they're going to be sewn together, I'm putting them right sides together so I'll fiddle with it after. We're going to trim those down to 1.5 by 3 inches. So as always, I'm going to clean cut 2 edges, and I should have put it on my smaller mat. Rotate the mat and double check your measurements. 1.5 by 3. So I'm putting my 1.5 inch mark on the long edge, my 3-inch mark on the short edge. Cut. And then we're going to take those pieces to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew 1/4 inch from the edge on both short edges. Here's my piece with my 2 short seams, and now we're going to cut this in half just once. We're going to put the 1.5 inch mark on our cut edge, and I am lining up another mark with my long edges just to keep everything straight, and cut. Pattern says press toward the red. It really doesn't make any difference just press both of them toward one of the colors. Don't press one toward the red and one toward the brown. Now I'm going to turn those two pieces in opposite directions and sew them together in a 4-patch. This is a beige strip that you have 2 pieces instead of 1. So I have stacked mine up and I'm going to cut them together. We're going to trim it down to 1 1/4 inches wide, and then we're going to cut 2 2.5 inch pieces and 2 4-inch pieces. You need to cut one of each from the strips to be able to get them both. Don't go cut 2 of the short ones out of one strip and then think you're going to get the 2 long ones out of the other. So 2.5 plus 4 is 6.5. So I'm going to cut it 1 1/4 is on the long edge, 6.5 is on the short edge. And then you can back your ruler up to either 4 inches or 2.5. It doesn't matter. I'm going to go to the 4-inch mark, which will give me 4 inches on this end and 2.5 on that end. You will see that I back my ruler up a lot. I subtract out measurements because it's a little bit faster because you're not having to keep moving your fabric around. You can cut without picking up your pieces and moving it off. It's also more accurate because you're always measuring from your piece that is squared off on this end. You're not cutting and then measuring from the cut edge. When you cut like a long row, say a 2.5 inch strip, and you're cutting 2.5 inch squares across the width of the fabric, as you cut a 2 inch square, move it out of the way, cut another one. Eventually, your edge starts getting a slant on it, so you have to straighten it up. Using this method where you're always backing up, you don't have to straighten up. So there's my pieces. And I'm going to take the 2.5 inch piece and sew it to opposite sides of my 4-patch. 2.5 inch pieces were sewn on and pressed toward the beige, and we're just going to add our 4-inch pieces to the other 2 sides, and again it will be pressed toward the beige. So I added my last 2 beige strips and pressed toward the beige. Our next step is to take our golden brown, or more gold in our case, and we're going to trim it down to 1 1/4 inches wide as well, and cut 2 4-inch pieces and 2 5.5 inch pieces. You will have some selvage on one end, so make sure you trim that off. So I am folding mine in half so that I'm cutting 2 layers at once. That's up to you. You could cut it one at a time if you want to. Turn my mat. So 4 inches plus 5.5 inches is 9.5. So I'm going to put my 1 1/4 along my long edge and my 9.5 along the short edge. Cut, cut, oops. And make sure you cut all the way through. There. I'm going to scoop my ruler back either to the 4-inch mark or to the 5.5 inch mark. It doesn't really matter. Since the 5.5 inch mark comes sooner, that's what I'm going to. And cut. So that's my 2 4-inch pieces and my 2 5.5 inch pieces. I'm going to sew my 2 4-inch pieces to the same sides where I sewed my 2.5 inch pieces, and I will be pressing out toward the gold. Okay, I sewed those gold pieces on and pressed toward the gold. Our last step for sewing this block is to add the other 2 pieces to the remaining 2 sides. Here's the completed double framed 4-patch. I pressed out, and as all the other blocks that we're doing this month, this one should measure 5.5 inches. Our next block is called building blocks. In your kit you have a dark purple square, a light blue strip, a beige floral, and a red strip. So from our purple square, we are going to cut a piece that is 1.5 by 2. So I'm going to clean cut 2 edges. And then I'm going to line up my 2-inch mark down on the bottom. It doesn't really matter. And my 1.5-inch mark along one edge and cut. From our blue strip, we're going to cut 4 1.5 by 3-inch pieces. So again, we're going to square up 2 edges. And I warned you, you would probably see me being bad, so there we go, I flipped it. We want 3.5 on the long edge, and 1.5 times 4 is 6 inches. So I'm going to go 3.5, 6 inches, cut, cut, and then 6 minus 1.5 is 4.5, so I'm going to back up to the 4.5-inch mark. I'm keeping a line on my long edges that are cut to keep everything straight. 4.5 on my short edge, cut. Then I'm going to back up to 3 inches, because 4.5 minus 1.5 is 3. And cut. And finally back up to 1.5 inches. So that gives me those 4 rectangles. We'll be cutting the red and the beige strips exactly the same size, so I'm cutting both of mine at the same time. There is a diagram on your pattern showing you how to cut this. We need it to be 3.5 inches this high this way. The first thing I'm going to do is clean cut 2 sides. And then I'm going to rotate my mat. And from these strips, we need 3 1.5-inch strips going that way. So 3 times 1.5 adds up to 4.5. And then we need a 2-inch wide section down here. So 4.5 plus 2 equals 6.5. So I'm going to put my 6.5-inch mark on the short edge, and the 3.5-inch mark on the long edge, and cut. And then I'm going to move this back to the 4.5-inch mark, because I'm going to leave my 2-inch section down on this end. So 4.5, remember it's only 2 and we need 3 times 1.5 here. So 4.5, cut. I'm going to move back to the 3-inch mark, and I'm always keeping lines on my long edge so that everything stays straight. And then back to 1.5. So I'm going to pick up my 3 1.5 by 3.5-inch pieces and set them aside. And then I need to cut 2 1.5 pieces out of my 2-inch section. So 1.5 times 2 is 3. So I have my 3-inch mark over here. I can line any line up with the long edges here to keep it all straight. Then we're going to back off to the 1.5. And cut. Now the first thing we're going to do is take the pieces that were 2 inches wide and sew them together in this order. So in the middle is purple, on both sides of the purple is our beige, and then the red is on the outside, and we're sewing along the long edges on that. Make sure your 1/4 inch seam is accurate. Here's my strip all sewn together. You're going to press toward one end. It really doesn't matter which end because it is a mirror image. And then we're going to trim this strip down to 1.5 inches wide. It should be 5.5 inches long. So we're going to clean cut one edge, and I do like to try to keep marks on my ruler on the seam allowances and on the end when I'm trimming something like this. That, rotate the mat. Yeah, I'm still gonna have to move it for the camera. There you go. And then we're gonna put the 1.5 inch mark on the edge we just cut. And again, it's good to have marks on the seam allowances. And 1.5 and cut. So set that strip aside. Now we're going to take some of the 3.5 inch long strips, beige, blue, red, blue, and beige, and we're going to sew that strip together along the long edge. Here's this section all sewn together. Again, pressed toward one end. It doesn't really matter which one because it's a mirror image. This one we're cutting into two 1.5 inch strips. So again, try to line up a line with your seam allowances. I'm going to clean cut and on the ends because we're not trimming the ends. Clean cut one edge. I'm going to rotate it because I'm cutting two 1.5 inch strips. I'm going to start by cutting a 3 inch one. So I'm going to line the 3 inch up with the long edge that I just trimmed. And cut, and then I'm going to go back to the 1.5 inch mark and cut, and we're going to set those pieces aside. And finally, our last group we're doing is going to be blue, red, beige, red, and blue. And again, we're going to sew them along the long edges. Okay, my strips are all sewn together. I press toward one end. Either end will do. Just press all the seams in one direction. We're going to cut this one exactly like we did the last one. We need two 1.5 inch strips out of it. So I'm going to try to line up my lines on the seam allowances and on the end. Cut. Rotate. 1.5 times 2 is 3. So I'm going to line the 3 inch mark up on the line that on the edge I just cut, trim, and then I'm going to go back to 1.5 inches. Okay, so now I have 5 different strips. We're ready to put it together into a block. This is going to be my middle strip, and then the one with beige in the center is going to be the other one. And you just want to turn these strips so that your seams are going in opposite directions. So that's that one, and that will go there. And this one goes here. And this one goes here. And we're just going to sew those rows together with a 1/4 inch seam. Here's the finished building blocks block. After I sewed the rows together, I pressed the seams in toward the center. Our last block for this month is the double 9 patch. The pattern says you have a red plaid square. It is not plaid, it's checked. We have a beige strip, a brown strip, and this is also a red strip, but it's more of a rectangle. We're going to trim our red square down to 1.5 by 2. So clean cut 2 edges. Rotate, and it should be 1.5 on one edge and 2 on the other. Cut. Then from the beige strip, we are going to cut it into two 1.5 by 3.5 inch pieces. So clean cut 2 edges. And again, I'm going to be bad and flip it around. We want it to be 1.5 inch wide. It's 2 3.5 inch pieces. So that means we need it 7 inches long, because 3.5 times 2 is 7. So I have my 1.5 inch mark here, my 7 inch mark here. I need to cut and cut, then back up to 3.5. And as usual, I'm keeping lines on my straight edges that I've already cut, my long ones. My 3.5 inch mark down here, and cut. And then from my brown strip, I need it cut down to 1.5 inches wide. I'm going to fold it in half. And clean cut here. And this time I'm not cutting the fold off. Leave it on. 1.5 inches wide. And the reason I'm not cutting the fold off is because we have an odd number of pieces to cut out of this strip. Then we need 3 3.5 inch pieces and 2 2-inch pieces. So 3.5 plus 2 is 5.5, and I am cutting a double thickness here, so I'm cutting 2 at once. So 3.5 and 2, yep, that's 5.5. So I'm lining up my 5 inch mark down here on the short end. I'm going to cut. Then I'm going to go back to the 3.5 inch mark and cut. So that gives me 2 of my 3.5 inch pieces and both of my 2 inch pieces. And then out of what's left, I just need 1 more 3.5 inch piece. And you do have a little extra here, so if you mess up, you do have enough that you could cut another piece. Cut, that's scrap. And then from our red strip, make sure you look at the diagram or pay attention to what I'm cutting here. We need a 3.5 inch square and 2 1.5 by 3.5 inch strips. So I'm going to clean cut 2 edges. And then I want it to be 3.5 inches wide going this way. 1.5 times 2 is 3, plus 3.5 is 6.5. So I have my 6.5 inch mark here and my 3.5 inch mark on the short edge. 3.5, 6.5, can't remember what I just said. I might have reversed it. And then I'm going to back up to the 3.5 inch mark. And get that square out of there so I don't accidentally cut it too small. And then this should be 3 inches remaining, so I just need to cut that in half. I'm going to line up the 3.5 inch mark with the cut edge and cut. Now take the 2 1.5 by 3.5 inch beige strips and sew them to both long sides of the 1.5 by 3.5 inch brown strip. My piece is sewn together and I'm pressed away from the center or away from the brown out toward the beige, and we're going to cut 2 1.5 inch strips off of this. So again, try to line up lines. Go 1.5, and then 1.5 times 2 is 3. Here, and then cut it at 1.5, which gives us our 2 1.5 inch strips. Set those aside. Then we're going to take our 1.5 by 2 inch piece of red and our two 1.5 by 2 inch pieces of brown and put them together like this, and sew again on the long edges. This section is finished. This time press toward the red, and we're going to cut this piece down into a 1.5 inch wide strip. And cut, rotate 1.5. So I got my 1.5 inch mark here and trim. Now we're going to take the 3 pieces we just made and sew them together into a 9 patch. They're going to go together like this, so you just sew the rows together. Here's my finished 9 patch. I have pressed it already, but you can pop the seams on the 9 patch as well, so that's what the pressing would look like. Now take your 1.5 by 3.5 strips of red and sew them to opposite sides of that 9 patch. Okay, my red strips are sewn on and I press toward the red. Now we're going to take our 3.5 inch square of red and our 2 remaining brown strips, and we're going to sew them onto opposite sides just like that. Brown strips are sewn on, and this time I pressed in toward the center, so toward the red, and we are going to once again cut 2 1.5 inch strips off of this piece. Half times 2 is 3. I'm going to cut a 3 inch wide strip and cut that in half. 1.5. And now those 2 pieces get added to the top and bottom of the rest of the block. Here's the finished double 9 patch. Once I sewed those 2 strips on, press away from the center. This block also should finish at 5.5 inches at this point.